Thank you. Thank you so much for coming out, and thank you to the Summit for having me. It's a real honor to be here, especially with this esteemed panel of distinguished guests. I'll start on the far, I guess my far right, your far left, with someone who really doesn't need any introduction at all, William Bratton, who until very recently was the commissioner of the New York Police Department, served time at the LAPD, a legendary figure. Really honored to have him. Next to him, we have Matthew Bradford, the director of the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau for the City of London Police Department. We've got Philip Reitinger, who is in December became the CEO of the Global Cyber Alliance, which we will learn more about this afternoon. And to my immediate right, we have Cyrus Vance Jr., the DA of the New York County. So thank you all for being here. Let's get right into it. We're here to talk about an emerging, a both familiar and emerging and new threat in the form of cybercrime. So let's talk about where we are in the world of cybercrime right now. We were talking about this backstage. You know, a couple of years ago, when the Sony hack broke, there was sort of a meta story around it, which was, can you believe that this happened? This year, as we've seen, for instance, Colin Powell's email get hacked. It almost goes without saying that his email got hacked. We were talking about the content of the email and not the fact of the hack. Is this the new normal? Is this the world that we live in now? Where are we and where are we going? I guess I'll start with, why don't we start with you? Why don't we start with you, Cyrus?
Thank you for having me here today. I would say that this is a new normal, and just to state the obvious, cybercrime is a huge issue. Cyber criminals present, I think, the biggest threat to our city and our country and beyond after terrorism, and those two are not unrelated in some instances. About a quarter of the cases that we file as our more serious charges are now cases of cybercrime. So it's an entirely different world than it was some years ago, and the pace of growth in cyber intrusions is also escalating hugely. So that's the world in which the Manhattan DA is operating in, and I expect others will have something similar.
Yeah, Phil, you've said that that the situation today is significantly worse than it was a year ago, and significantly worse than, even more worse than it was 5 years ago. Are we losing this battle right now?
So I wouldn't say we're losing this battle, and we clearly, as the district attorney said, are in the new normal. The caveat I'd add is that don't think the new normal is static. The new normal for the foreseeable future is going to continue to get worse because it has for the last 20 years. The curves are, our defensive capabilities go up every year. We get better and better at defending, but the bad guys and the number of threats and the vulnerabilities they can attack go up every year too. So year over year, we're not narrowing the gap yet. The gap is getting broader, and I think the place where the time until we can put a delta on that curve and start to move them closer together towards us becoming more secure than less secure is probably at least 10 years away. So it's not gloom and doom, it's not forever, but it does require directed action, and it's not going to happen this year, and it's not going to happen next year, and it's probably not going to happen in the next 5 years.
Are you seeing something similar, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. So in London and the UK, we have the benefit of a national reporting centre, which means that we can, in theory, capture all the threats and risks and harm that are affecting, whether it be members of the public, small and medium enterprises, or large corporates. The problem we're seeing is that cyber is a significantly underreported crime. So how can you possibly target the threats if you don't know the impact that it's having? So we have around 800,000 frauds and cyber crimes in the UK from members of the public, industry and banks. But actually a recent crime survey dwarfs that figure. That figure is dwarfed to over 5 million. Well, where are these other crimes? And they're dealing with it in silos rather than sharing the problem with law enforcement. And no doubt we'll get onto that later on. But there's a real challenge whereby if you don't know the threats that are coming towards the victims aren't putting faith in law enforcement to respond, how can law enforcement solve those problems that are affected by cybercrime?
Commissioner Bratton, you said recently that a larger percentage of New York gang crime is now cyber. Can you who are cyber criminals these days, and has the character of that changed over the years?
Well, first off, I think if I could provide maybe a definition of cyber, and this is for attribution purposes. Richard Clark, former head of former National Security Advisor Bill Clinton, gave a talk several years ago, and my wife Ricky Kleeman is a criminal defense attorney. When she presents to jury, she says, "Keep everything in 3s and 4s, otherwise you lose them, and you get guilty verdicts." So when Richard Clark talked about cyber, he put it into 4 buckets and he used the acronym CHEW. So cyber can fall into C, crime, my former world; H, hacking; mischief of otherwise; E, espionage. And espionage has a lot of different buckets, whether it's industrial espionage, nation-state espionage, political espionage, and then certainly the one that we're all concerned with because of its catastrophic capability, warfare. So the world is a very diverse one. Cy and I spend most of our time in the, I formerly did, now my private sector position with Teneo, being asked to develop something much more focused for CEOs and the multiplicity of concerns they have. But I've just watched this evolve over time to the scale that it's now. But of a $450 billion, $500 billion estimated loss in terms of loss of value as a result of it. Back in 1994, I created the first computer theft unit in the NYPD, if not one of the first in the country. And that was to deal with this new crime that we're starting to come across, identity theft. And then a year and a half ago, as commissioner of the NYPD, created the 250-person cyber crime unit to deal with what Cy's talking about. 60 to 70% of the crime below 59th Street is cyber-related, whether somebody's stealing a phone or stealing identity. So to give you a sense of how the world has changed in just one generation, and that's what we're dealing with. It keeps magnifying. I think it's by 2019, they're estimating the loss due to cybercrime might be as high as $2 trillion a year. That's a phenomenal problem to be dealing with.
From a policing standpoint, do you deal with those 4 buckets as distinct kinds of crime, or are they operationally very, very similar kinds of threats?
Well, for purposes of crime, there's various definitions that would work with. Hacking is sometimes can move into the criminal. Oftentimes it's nuisance, mischief, the challenge of breaking into a system and not seeking to make a profit out of it or to get information that can be sold elsewhere. The espionage one I talked about it's multiple in the world I'm now dealing with CEOs, Fortune 100, Fortune 500, phenomenal concern. And oftentimes the threat is, the concern they're most concerned with is the external threat, somebody trying to access. But increasingly we're finding that the threat is internal also. Employees who unintentionally or intentionally are creating great risk for the CEO in his or her company. So the world it's linked. Hacking can be crime. Espionage can be hacking crime. Warfare is in a world of its own that fortunately I've not had to have any responsibility for that one, nor would I want to have responsibility for that one.
When we think of policing, we tend to think of location as one of the organizing ways we think about whose responsibility it is. In a world without barriers and boundaries, I imagine these things quickly extend beyond the precincts that we've set up for them. Maybe everyone here can sort of talk about how, first of all, the kinds of challenges that presents, and also maybe the kind of opportunities that presents. How has your job changed, and how do you think about what your territory and your responsibility actually is in this new linked kind of distance is dead kind of world?
Well, for us in Manhattan, it has absolutely changed the way we investigate crime, number one. It's not just that 25% of our indictments are cybercrime, it's 100% of our cases involve digital evidence. There is virtually no case where a cell phone is not involved or some other communication, whether it's a sexual assault, a homicide, or an economic crime. So as a major metropolitan office, it has, when I was elected in 2009, I immediately understood that cybercrime was that area where I had to place a big bet in terms of developing expertise, manpower, and space. And and with the opening of our own cyber lab next month, I think we are as positioned as well as any prosecutor's office probably in the world in terms of our internal capacity to do cyber cases, do our own forensics when the NYPD is backed up with 4 other DA's offices. You have to really be able to respond quickly, and unfortunately you can't always rely on the traditional partners who you used to rely on. The opportunities, and I think, Jason, you stop me if you don't want to go there yet. The opportunities, I think, are, one, cyber is international, and it's why the City of London Police and the Manhattan DA's office decided 2 years ago to start working together to share personnel, to learn from each other about how we were dealing with the threats in our metropolitan areas, and to build cases together. And so all this is international crime, and so the opportunities, and I think the requirements are that cities like London and ourselves, as metropolitan entities, are going to be collaborating with each other in ways that has not been the case historically. And third, the opportunity really is, as investigators, is, however, also to think about attacking cybercrime not just by investigating, indicting, arresting, and trying to sentence. That is the way we've always done the job, and I'm sure that we're going to continue to do that at a high level and at high volume. But I believe that the next phase for us to work in terms of fighting cybercrime is to focus on prevention. And so as a law enforcement entity, not just be focused on indictment and arrest, but identifying strategies, working with Phil and others, where we can push out prevention strategies that may actually have a greater impact on bending that curve Phil is talking about than anything we'll do taking criminals down one by one by one.
So that's absolutely correct. I couldn't have put it better, Mr. Vance. We're the global cyber alliance for a reason. Cybercrime is inherently global right now. Cyber attacks are global. People think, well, they think about the DNC hacks and North Korea and Iran and other sorts of entities engaging in international attacks. But in point of fact, you can have a purely physical crime on the streets of New York, and the data may well be stored in Norway or France or Ireland or Singapore, because the data goes all over the place. The world has been brought together, and we really require global action. It's not a new idea to say this. The attorney generals and ministries of the interior in the Group of 8 nations back in 1997 had their very first principle was there must be no safe havens for cybercrime. Because if there's any one safe haven, I mean, I don't care if it's a nation of 30 people in the Caribbean or in the South Pacific, it doesn't matter. Data can be stored there, communications can be sent there, and it can impose a barrier on bringing about the rule of law online, which is why the Global Cyber Alliance, with the leadership of both the City of London Police, the District Attorney, and the Center for Internet Security, is focused on global community action, because that's really the only way we're going to put a negative delta, reduce the amount of cybercrime and cyber harm we see globally.
And I think it reflects a change in the attitude of law enforcement. I think one that Bill and the City of London share, and increasingly folks around the world, I think, believe. I think we're interested today as investigators and police officers in reducing crime in a sustained way. It's not about just arrests. It's about any strategy that helps reduce crime in a sustained way is crime fighting. And so our job now as crime fighters, we're using strategies related to crime prevention across the board. And we measure, as CompStat did under Bill and the New York City Police Department, the ability to reduce crime over the long term. Nowhere is this more relevant than in the cyber world.
Yeah, so from a City London point of view, the police service was established 176 years ago under the premise of protect the Queen's peace, protect people from crime. I think over the last 20 or 30 years, we've been so intent on pursuing offenders because that's what is tangible and real. You can actually go and get the person that's assaulted someone. Look at the events over the last 48 hours. It's the success in obviously catching that person that was responsible. The UK strategy is linking in with what's already been said. It's the 4P approach. It's about working to prepare for the eventuality that we can foresee. It's about pursuing those offenders, but the real new branch in policing in the UK is about the protect and prevent. And although they mean different things, prevent is obviously preventing those people entering into that cycle of crime. And in cyber, where does that start? Is it the gaming industry? Is it the youth of today that's going to be the cyber security experts in the future, or the cyber criminals? But the real essence that the City of London Police has taken on is about the protection, and is about giving small, medium enterprise and companies and individuals the tools that they need to protect themselves. But we're needing a fundamental change. But that investment takes time. It's difficult to change that cultural barrier. So that's where policing is changed. We've gone kind of full circle. Protect, pursue, and now we're going back to a protect emphasis, which is the only way that we are going to make some inroads to make the negative delta change that that Phil makes reference to.
I want to ask about this question about the preventive policing metaphor. From the people that I've spoken with, the idea in security used to be, you had a firewall that people could not get inside. From everyone that I talk to now, that metaphor no longer holds. You have to assume that people are getting in, and the question becomes, how do you minimize the damage? The people that I speak to don't talk about prevention, I guess is what I'm saying. They're talking about accept the fact that it's going to happen, and now what? So I guess I would just ask, how does the prevention metaphor work in a world where where firewalls don't work anymore?
So I'd say, I think you do need to assume compromise, and I think now, in most cases, somebody is in, but that doesn't mean 20 people are in, and it doesn't mean they've gotten to your core assets as opposed to something you don't care very much about. Prevention is about reducing your degree of risk, not eliminating it. And that's what all of the entities up here are talking about. And I don't think that in the long term that it has to be true that we can assume people are in. It just takes a difference in how we approach this. We actually have to start treating it, not only in the United States, but globally, as a national security and a global security issue. I mean, we still see things coming out of Washington and other capitals where they'll announce a new program that has $10 million. Give me $1 billion. If the US government is doing it, there ought to be $1 billion behind it. It takes the sort of approach we are trying to do is say, this is strategic, but we're going to attack the strategic through the lens of the tactical. We need an approach where everybody, all of us in this room, every day tries to show up and do something measurable, reduce the amount of risk that we've all got. And if we do that in the right way, we can change the game. There are things that we can do to change the game that will make everybody more secure.
Well, that tees up another question. So what are those things? I mean, we've been speaking in abstractions, but how does the Global Cyber Alliance work, and how is it different than all the efforts that have come before to share information and reduce threats that way?
Well, I don't know that it's different than all the other efforts that have come before, but it is almost unique in one way. The Global Cyber Alliance is global, so it covers every country of the world, or will cover every country of the world. It's cross-sectoral, so anyone can join and is free to join. And as I said, we're focused on measurable improvement. So we don't write reports and recommendations. We look for big issues, systemic risks, things that affect more than one company, that can affect a national economy. And then we try to attack that not by saying, what's the solution, but by saying, there's a solution here that's just not being implemented. And what we want to do is put together the right expertise, the people, the resources to tackle that problem and implement the solution. And then measure what the effect is. So it's not at the end of the day, we think the government needs to do X and the private sector needs to do Y, but we've implemented this something and we can measurably reduce the risk. So eventually, it's not $2 trillion of harm in 2020, it's maybe 1.5 trillion. And if you focus on the concrete and do things that way, you can actually put a negative, you can reduce the risk in particular places.
Jason, I also think that what led to the creation of the Global Cyber Alliance was a philosophical belief, and that enforcement was not going to achieve as much crime fighting capacity as it used to, and we had to move to prevention. But I think it also reflects, at least my personal view, and I expect everybody up here, cybercrime is a global challenge. And I think it needs to be approached by the world and business community as a global challenge. And that means that the City of London Police, the Manhattan DA's office, the New York City Police Department, the City of New York, aerospace, communications, finance, transportation, these are sectors which do not communicate with each other about cyber risk or shared cyber solutions or how to collectively manage those risks in the big corporate environment, but just as important, in the small to medium business environment and personal computing. So at its core, this is a start. Now with 90+ members from Boeing or to Microsoft to other companies, which is designed to bring our resources together to create collective solutions, identifying the core risks, whether it's the DNS or the DMARC work that we're doing, create those, share those, and in that way push this out, open source it, so that it can be implemented across sectors, across the globe, and our office felt strong enough about this, and I did, that we invested $25 million of forfeiture funding to make sure that the idea can be birthed and can get up and going.
Can maybe the rest of you can talk about how you got involved in the alliance as well? What were you seeing, and why did you, what was it about the GCA that struck you?
$25 million probably had something to do with it. I'm probably speaking to the Commissioner Leppard, who retired, and Mr. Dyson, so I'm representing them. But it's because of some of the points we made earlier in terms of the financial districts of the City of London and the financial district of Manhattan, how they share some empathy and crossover. The GCA, there are a lot of US-based members. Clearly the desire is to increase that across Europe. That's a little bit harder with Brexit, but we're not quite as popular as we were when we go to Brussels and Strasbourg and Paris. But I know the London office is going to get bigger, and that will be one of the desires, to improve and increase the number of European and UK-based entities, because that's where the success lies. And there was probably some, not suspicion is probably the wrong word, reticence as to, well, what's the output of GCA? It's been going since whenever this year. What's the output? But as Phil has explained, it's not really an output machine, it's a concept. And it's harder for those institutions that, what am I going to get from it? How am I going to integrate with it? But we've turned a corner now, and certainly from a UK policing point of view, we've got a national cybercrime unit who are this new kid on the block. How are they going to do things different to us? But they assumed it was going to do the same things that the cybercrime unit does. But the GCA is different. It's about understanding what the risks are, looking for some solutions, and then putting something to action. It's not a law enforcement body in the sense of pursuing. It's a concept. So we hope over the next 2 or 3 months, and certainly I'm sure Phil will explain a few more details of what's going to happen in the next couple of months, you will start seeing that output and what's going to change and how GCA can actually add to that landscape. And for good, which is what is the full emphasis of what we're trying to achieve here.
So I might add, Matthew's absolutely right. So we, as I said, focus on strategic issues by what can we do, how can we implement a particular solution. The outcome of our first 2 projects, I hate to throw out acronyms to you. One is on DMARC and one is on DNS. I won't go through a whole lot of detail about those, but I will tell you that our intent is to report out in November, because we're going to do these things in sort of 6-month increments. We've got an attention deficit disorder approach to these sorts of things. We try and find a problem, work to solve it, and then move on. So we're going to report out in November of this year on those 2 projects, and our intent is to, at any point in time when we talk about risk reduction, to put that in monetary units, because that's really something that matters to people, dollars or pounds or something. How much have we actually reduced the risk? In terms of what's the motivation behind this, our view is that there's a lot of risk out there. I think we've covered that. The The survey that Matthew mentioned before showed that in the United Kingdom and Wales, in England and Wales, that a person is 14 times more likely to face a cyber event than they are to face a burglary. That's kind of shocking that crime has reached that degree. The good part is people want change. You know, I've been doing this for 20 years. There's a large number of people, you see 4 of them up here, that want to drive difference. I like to think of the people that are behind the Global Cyber Alliance as a coalition of the angry. You know, people who have seen this, have seen the situation get worse, and want to actually make a difference. And so that's our goal. We're very focused on the concrete. We've got an array of partners, including both the City of London Police and the District Attorney of New York, but Microsoft, Barclays, it's like a who's who list of big companies that are interested in making a difference. And in November, you will see some specific results point out that show a way forward, and we will continue to tackle these sorts of projects and bring a global community to tackle them.
I thought, if I may, we haven't discussed at all to this point the concerns around privacy, the tension right now between law enforcement, some of the manufacturers, Apple and others, around the issue of encryption. And we've heard a lot of conversation around the idea of collaboration. This whole effort is the understanding of really trying to understand all aspects of the problem, so that you have, 1, admit we have a problem, 2, understand its elements, and then really work towards solution. One of the major issues on the crime side of this, and it also spills very heavily into the private sector, so many of the corporate clientele, when they do have an incident, are unwilling, we talked about at the beginning of this session, that tremendous amount of unreported crime. And in the corporate world, there's a great fear of, by bringing in, particularly the federal agencies, the FBI, who probably have, in the law enforcement world, the most significant expertise, that letting them into the wheelhouse, basically letting the fox into the hen house. So the desire to protect the proprietary interests of the company, its trade secrets, et cetera, is a great disincentive to effectively collaborate with law enforcement. So we have a more significant, I shouldn't say we anymore, basically, old habits are hard to break, though, 46 years on one side. But the understanding that to really get our arms around this problem, that in some respects with the encryption issue growing significantly inside, Vance has been one of the leading proponents about really addressing that issue. And then secondly, the fear of sharing with government, police, FBI, internal issues, that we're approaching this problem definitely with one hand tied behind our back, if not both. And these are issues, as these problems expand, that we're going to have to find some way to address. And I think the effort that they've engaged in this collaboration is a significant first step moving forward.
And Jason, this was designed to not be law enforcement. Right. This is a not-for-profit called the Global Cyber Alliance that has a board of directors on which I do not sit, and Commissioner Dyson does not sit. It has a separate technical advisory board that Phil and others have put together with very talented computer scientists, and it is working with them that they have helped analyze the threats, helped us prioritize them, and then it has a strategic advisory board with many representatives from businesses and government who are essentially setting the policy. So we felt it was important that this not be perceived to be an evidence-gathering tool for government. It's not collecting personal identifying information to share with the FBI. It is essentially trying to find solutions and then share those solutions. And when we're able to collect information that isn't about intelligence, where are these threats coming from, or where are these attacks coming from, to be able to find that, and then that can be used against those who are doing the attacking, not taking anything away from the companies who are participating. And this is, as far as I can tell, a new thing. And we want to be perceived as, I think, law enforcement and corporations and governments should be perceived. We share 99.9% of the same goals. And we all want to focus on those shared goals. And as far as I'm concerned, it's time for us all, prosecutors, police departments, businesses, individuals, to all get on board to try to fight a global threat, which, at least in my view, I'm not sure is actually being approached as a global threat that we are taking on as a challenge we are all either going to solve or we're all going to get drowned by it.
In the introduction to this, it was indicated that we would have some recommendations for the incoming administration, whatever that may be. Phil, maybe we should start with you. Like, what are more, if we have been missing the point of this as a global threat, what beyond changing our way of thinking, like what are actually actionable steps that we should be taking that we're not, from at a federal level, to fight this battle better?
So I'd say there are a number of different things. The administration did an announcement called CNAP about 6 months ago, which was mostly a dead letter because it was a outgoing administration to a Republican Congress, and it was a lot of budget recommendations that aren't going to go anywhere. But it did have one very specific thing that I think is particularly important. It included that the federal government should not only get out of the business of cybersecurity for the most part, but it should get out of the business of IT wherever it could. That we need governments and industries where they can't adequately secure things to use cloud providers or other services and consume security as a part of it. So that's a very specific thing that I think governments can do. Consume IT as a managed service, consume security as a managed service. The other thing I'd call out is, I think there is an approach here. And the approach is to not always be chaos-driven. So it's not, who hacked the latest person? Because there's always, we're talking about this before, right? There's always a new story about who hacked and what the consequence was. It's what do we really want to accomplish? What are the systemic risks, like phishing, that we want to address? And then how do we concretely change that? How do we work as a community to actually affect that risk? And I think that, both going to the cloud and putting that kind of change on the approach is very valuable.
Can we talk about phishing for a second? Just before this panel goes away, we were talking backstage, and you were saying that one of the interesting dynamics of this is, we've gone from a world in which the big threat was, Phil Mitnick calling somebody on a phone and tricking them into, divulging something, past a, much more corporatized, virus-based kind of world, and now we're kind of back to the social engineering hacks and the, how is there an automated solution or a systemic solution to prevent kind of the frailties of human weakness and credulousness? Like how is there a technological solution to the problem of social engineering?
So I don't know about the problem of social engineering in particular, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say it was Kevin Mitnick as opposed to
I'm sorry,
Phil
yes,
Mitnick.
of course, yes. Sorry.
There's almost nothing new in cyber. For those of you who've been in this game for a while, you've seen it. So I was told a few years ago that, that we were in a new environment now because we had phishing. But in point of fact, phishing was how hackers used to get into things back in the 70s and 80s. That was the common way. You pick up the phone and you call somebody in a telephone company and you get in. But now we've automated it. The bad guys can scale. That's the big difference. And in point of fact, you are quite correct. The long-term solution is to use automation. We need to build techniques. We need to build an ecosystem that is fundamentally different than what we have right now. We need to have automated detection and response. We need to be in an environment where our computer systems defend themselves the way our bodies do. We need immune systems where we can use every lever. We can bring every lever to bear, particularly in an automated way. And there are, in a 40-minute panel, it's hard to go about how to do that. But in short, the emphasis is on authentication, automation, and interoperability. And it's those three pieces working together that will make a huge difference. In the meantime, until we change the ecosystem, we need to focus on the concrete differences. We need to actually build things that will reduce the threat. And there is nothing new under the sun.
Commissioner Bratton, I want to go over to you. You've started a new role at Teneo Holdings, heading up their risk management division. For maybe some of the people in the audience here who want to know what should they be doing? What should I be doing? What should we all be doing other than not opening attachments? Are there actionable steps that we could be taking right now to help this just in our own backyard?
Well, first and foremost is to recognize that everybody is at risk. That's the reality of this world. As great as this world is, as much as it's exploded, that everybody is continually at risk. And the challenge to law enforcement, the entities that provide these services, is to try and keep developing preventative measures to keep those who would seek to harm an individual, a company, a city, a country. So in the world that I'm going into, the company I'm joining, that we're being asked to effectively try to really be very good at risk mitigation, which is the identification of the potential threat, the idea of how to respond, how to prevent, and to also constantly stay ahead of the curve rather than being behind it, which is so often the case. And an extraordinarily challenging world, and one that I found certainly during my time in law enforcement, as I did. It is fascinating that I was in law enforcement for 45 years. When I began, the state of the art was a 3-pound walkie-talkie that passed for very sophisticated technology. And I was very happy to come back into policing in LA in 2002, right after 9/11, because the world of technology, cyber, literally exploded after 9/11 in terms of being able to deal with the terrorist threat. And then these 3 years back in New York was at a time of phenomenal growth in the world of technology and cyber, new types of crime. And the world just changes it so fast. And if you don't change with it, you're going to lose. And so the themes here: collaboration for purposes of prevention, collaborations for purposes of detection, collaboration for purposes of identification of new ways to do things. It's all of those things. And if you don't collaborate, I wrote a book several years ago, not really focusing on this issue, predated a lot of the cyber world that was so involved in, but it was the idea you either collaborate or perish in the 21st century as a company, as a city, as a country. It's a fascinating world, and one that just gets more complex all the time. And if you don't get complex with it, then you're going to lose.
I think this also is an opportunity to show how some change in collective commitment can actually impact crime. So we all remember the 1970s and 80s and early 90s. I was a young assistant.
Some of us do. Looking at this audience, many of you do not.
Yeah, we're looking at Bill. You and I remember. And some very interesting things were going on. Every year, we expected crime to get worse in those years. And you know what? It did, every year. And at some point, and I don't know when in time that point occurred. Perhaps it was September 11th. Perhaps it was not until Bill had come in and started to show real results in CompStat. But at some point, we all decided that it was going to get better each year and safer each year. And you know what? It has. And we hold our elected officials accountable, and we hold our law enforcement officials accountable to making it safer each year. And I think if we, as a New York community, and I don't think it's too ambitious to talk about a cross-Atlantic or world community, if we all commit to the proposition that we are actually going to commit time to take on what is probably one of the biggest threats we'll face in our lifetimes, well, you know what? We actually might do something. But I guarantee you, if we don't do that, every year, it'll get worse and worse.
It's a shared responsibility.
Well, that was a lovely note to end on. Thank you for bringing it home. Gentlemen, thank you so much. A great honor to talk to you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.